One day, Colin said to Mary, Dickon, and Ben, "When I was going to try to stand that first time, I remember whispering to me, 'You can do it.' And I did. Now I'm going to walk around the whole garden." Colin rose slowly, with Mary and Dickon on either side. Ben Weatherstaff walked behind, and the lamb, fox cub, Soot, and a white rabbit trailed after them. Can you see them all in the picture? "I did it!" he cried. Oops, sorry. The procession moved slowly, stopping every few yards to rest until Colin had walked all the way around the garden. "I did it!" he cried. "This is to be the biggest secret of all. No one will know anything about it until I can walk and run like any boy." Most of all, Colin wanted to surprise his father when he returned home from his trip abroad. During the time Colin was discovering the joys of the secret garden, his father was walking through a quiet forest in Austria. Archibald Craven had traveled throughout Europe, seeing some of the most beautiful places in the world, but their beauty did not seem to touch him. In the silence of the Austrian forest, Mr. Craven decided to rest for a while. He lay down on the carpet of moss next to a stream. Soon he fell into a deep, deep sleep. When he awoke, he shook his head in wonder. "What a strange, wonderful dream I had," he exclaimed. "There was Colin, clear as day, crying out, 'I'm going to live forever and ever and ever.'" Mr. Craven was puzzled by the dream, but did not think much more about it. Still, as he continued traveling, Mr. Craven slowly felt stronger and happier. He slept well at night, and when he looked in the mirror, his back no longer seemed so crooked. Gradually, he began to think of Misselthwaite Manor. One night he dreamed he was in his wife's garden. The dream seemed so real that he thought he smelled the roses. A few days later, Mr. Craven decided to go home. As the train whirled him through the mountain passes and grassy plains, Mr. Craven thought about his son. He'd not meant to be a bad father, but he'd never really felt like a father at all. Now that he felt so much better, Mr. Craven looked at his life in a new way. "Perhaps I've been wrong all these years," he thought. Suddenly, he wanted very much to see the son that he had neglected for so long. When he arrived back home at last, Mr. Craven asked, "Where's Colin?" "In the garden, sir," replied Mrs. Medlock. Mr. Craven immediately went to the ivy-covered door. Then he stopped and listened. There were sounds inside the garden, sounds of running, scuffling feet, exclamations, and happy cries. As he listened, the sounds grew louder and louder. Curious, he yanked the door wide open. At that moment, a boy burst through the door and dashed headlong into him. Caught by surprise, Mr. Craven held out his arms just in time to save the boy from falling. This was not the meeting that Colin had planned. "Father," he said, standing as tall as he could, "it's me, Colin." Mr. Craven could scarcely believe his eyes. "No one knows I can walk," his son continued breathlessly. "We kept it a secret so you would be the first to know. I'm well, and I just beat Mary in a foot race. I'm going to be an athlete." He said it all like a healthy boy. His face flushed, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness. Mr. Craven shook with joy as he embraced his son. For the rest of the day, Mary, Dickon, and Colin took turns telling him about the garden and its magic. As the sun set that day, Martha and Mrs. Medlock looked out toward the garden. They couldn't hardly believe their eyes. Walking along one side of Mr. Craven were Mary and Dickon and a parade of little animals. On the other side, Mr. Craven had his arm around his son's shoulders. He was beaming, and Colin, feeling stronger than ever, proudly walked beside him. It was the first of what would be many walks together. Thank you, Robin, for showing Mary where the key was. And there's a picture of the beautiful secret garden.